The autumn of 1847 brought an unseasonable chill to Magnolia Grove Plantation, but nothing could match the coldness that had settled between Cornelius Whitmore and his wife, Evangeline. The wealthy tobacco planter stood in his mahogany-paneled study, watching through tall windows as his enslaved workers moved through the fields like shadows against the dying light. Evangeline had grown considerably larger since their marriage 5 years prior, her once delicate frame now straining against the confines of her elaborate gowns. The social gatherings that once brought Cornelius prestige now filled him with shame as he watched other planters' wives glide gracefully through ballrooms while his spouse struggled with each step. In the quarters behind the main house lived Samuel, a man whose small stature had earned him cruel nicknames, but whose intelligence burned bright behind careful eyes. Born with dwarfism, he had learned early that survival meant invisibility, that safety lay in being overlooked and underestimated. That evening, as rain drummed against the mansion's windows, Cornelius made a decision that would shatter the fragile order of their world. He summoned Samuel to the house, not for the usual tasks of serving dinner or tending fires, but for something far more sinister. The wealthy man's pride had curdled into something toxic, and he could no longer bear the whispered mockery of his peers about his wife's appearance. What happened next would test the boundaries of human dignity, challenge the very foundations of power, and set in motion a chain of events that none of them could foresee. In a world where some humans owned others, where women were property and the powerless had no voice, an unthinkable arrangement was about to begin. Cornelius paced behind his desk like a caged animal, his leather boots clicking against polished hardwood. Samuel stood motionless near the door, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond his master's shoulder. Years of enslavement had taught him to read the dangerous shifts in white men's moods, and tonight the air crackled with something particularly volatile. "You will attend to my wife's needs," Cornelius announced without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Samuel's expression remained carefully neutral, though his mind raced to comprehend the full meaning behind the euphemism. Evangeline knew nothing of this arrangement. She spent her days in the parlor, embroidering or reading romantic novels, unaware that her husband's resentment had grown into something monstrous. Her weight gain had been gradual, the result of loneliness and the endless availability of rich foods. But Cornelius saw only his own diminished status reflected in her expanded form. The plantation owner outlined his expectations with clinical detachment, as if discussing the breeding of livestock. Samuel would be moved to quarters closer to the main house. He would be responsible for Evangeline's comfort and companionship during Cornelius's frequent business trips to Richmond and Charleston. The arrangement would remain their secret, sealed by the absolute power Cornelius held over Samuel's life. As the rain intensified outside, Samuel felt something die within him. Not hope. That had been buried long ago, but perhaps the last vestige of his ability to be shocked by the depths of human cruelty. He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that sealed his fate and transformed him from field hand to unwilling participant in his master's twisted game. The next morning arrived gray and oppressive, matching the mood that had settled over Magnolia Grove like a burial shroud. Evangeline sat at her vanity, brushing her auburn hair with mechanical precision, unaware that her life was about to change irrevocably. The mirror reflected not just her physical form, but years of accumulated loneliness. Each pound gained a testament to emotional hunger that food could never truly satisfy. Samuel moved through his new routine with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to survive by anticipating needs before they were spoken. He brought tea to the parlor, arranged flowers from the garden, and maintained the careful distance that his position demanded. Yet something had shifted in the delicate ecosystem of the plantation. The other enslaved people sensed it immediately. The way Samuel's shoulders carried a new burden, the haunted quality that had crept into his usually steady gaze. Cornelius watched from his study window as Samuel crossed the courtyard, carrying a silver tray laden with Evangeline's afternoon refreshments. The planter's satisfaction was tinged with something darker, a perverse pleasure in orchestrating this degradation of both his wife and his property. He had found a way to punish Evangeline for her perceived failures while simultaneously asserting his dominance over Samuel in the most intimate way possible. In the slave quarters, whispered conversations died abruptly whenever Samuel approached. The community that had once offered him protection through solidarity now viewed him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Some understood that he had no choice in the matter, while others wondered if he had somehow brought this fate upon himself. The weight of secrets pressed down on all three participants in this unholy arrangement, each trapped in their own prison of circumstance and expectation. The first time Evangeline truly looked at Samuel, not through him or past him, but directly into his eyes, something unexpected occurred. She was struggling to reach a book from a high shelf in the library when he appeared silently beside her, climbing onto a chair to retrieve the volume. Their hands touched briefly as he passed her the leather-bound collection of poetry, and in that moment she saw not the diminutive figure her husband had assigned to her service, but a man whose intelligence and dignity had somehow survived years of systematic dehumanization. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than such a simple phrase should bear. Samuel nodded, but something in his expression suggested he had heard not just gratitude, but recognition. Perhaps the first time in years that someone had acknowledged his humanity. Their subsequent interactions carried an undercurrent of careful navigation around the dangerous territory they had been forced to occupy. Evangeline began to notice things about Samuel that had previously escaped her attention. The way he arranged flowers with an artist's eye for beauty, his gentle handling of her books, the quiet competence with which he managed the countless small tasks that made her daily life possible. For his part, Samuel observed Evangeline with growing complexity of feeling. He saw past her physical form to the loneliness that radiated from her like heat from a fever. She was as much a prisoner as he was, trapped by different bars, but equally confined by the expectations and limitations imposed by their society. Neither spoke of the arrangement that had brought them together, but both understood that they were being used as instruments in Cornelius's cruel orchestra. The question that haunted them both was whether they would allow themselves to become willing participants in their own degradation or find some way to preserve their dignity within the confines of their impossible situation. As weeks passed, the forced proximity between Evangeline and Samuel began to reveal truths that neither had expected to discover. During long afternoons in the parlor, while Evangeline worked on her embroidery and Samuel tended to household tasks, conversations began to emerge from the silence. At first, they were tentative exchanges about books or the weather, but gradually they evolved into something more substantial. Evangeline learned that Samuel could read, a dangerous secret in a world where literacy among enslaved people was forbidden. He had taught himself using discarded newspapers and books left behind by Cornelius's children from his first marriage. In return, she shared her own form of imprisonment, the suffocating expectations of Southern womanhood, the way her worth had been reduced to her appearance and her ability to reflect well upon her husband's status. The revelation that shook them both came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Evangeline discovered Samuel in the library, not dusting or organizing, but reading. He was absorbed in a volume of Shakespeare, his lips moving silently as he worked through the complex language. When he realized he had been discovered, fear flashed across his features, the kind of terror that comes from knowing that knowledge itself could be a death sentence. "Please," he whispered, closing the book with trembling hands. But instead of anger or threats to report him, Evangeline did something that surprised them both. She sat down across from him and asked, "What do you think of Hamlet's soliloquy?" The question hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. In that moment, they crossed from the roles that had been assigned to them into something far more dangerous. They began to see each other as equals, as fellow human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control. This recognition would prove to be both their salvation and their greatest peril. The change in Evangeline was subtle at first, noticed only by Samuel, who had learned to read the smallest shifts in mood and demeanor. She began to eat less, not from any conscious effort to lose weight, but because the conversations they shared seemed to nourish her in ways that food never could. Her embroidery grew more intricate, her reading more voracious, as if she were awakening from a long sleep. Samuel, too, was transforming. The careful invisibility that had protected him for years began to crack, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been in a different world. He started to carry himself differently, his shoulders straighter, his movements less deferential. The change was dangerous. Enslaved people who forgot their place rarely lived long to regret it. Their afternoon conversations became the center of both their days. They discussed literature, philosophy, and the world beyond the plantation's borders. Evangeline shared stories of her childhood in Charleston, while Samuel spoke carefully about his memories of his mother, sold away when he was 12. These exchanges were acts of rebellion in themselves, moments of human connection that defied the dehumanizing system that sought to reduce them both to their most basic functions. Cornelius, when he was present, noticed his wife's gradual transformation with growing unease. She seemed more animated, more present than she had been in years. Her laughter, when it came, was genuine rather than the forced gaiety she had displayed at social gatherings. He had intended to humiliate her, but instead she appeared to be flourishing. The other enslaved people on the plantation watched Samuel's evolution with a mixture of admiration and terror. They recognized the signs of a man who was remembering his own worth, and they knew how such awakenings typically ended. Some began to distance themselves from him, while others offered subtle gestures of support, understanding that his fate was somehow tied to all of theirs. The turning point came on a humid evening in late summer when Cornelius returned unexpectedly from a business trip to find Evangeline and Samuel in the library, engaged in animated discussion about a passage from Frederick Douglass's narrative. The sight that greeted him was his worst nightmare realized: his wife, animated and engaged, treating an enslaved man as an intellectual equal. The rage that consumed Cornelius was primal, rooted not just in the violation of social taboos, but in the recognition that his carefully constructed hierarchy was crumbling. He had created this arrangement to assert his dominance, but instead he had inadvertently provided both his wife and his property with something far more dangerous than comfort. They had found dignity in each other's company. "What is the meaning of this?" Cornelius's voice cut through the evening air like a whip crack. Evangeline looked up from her book, and for the first time in their marriage, she did not flinch or immediately begin to apologize. Instead, she met his gaze with something approaching defiance. Samuel immediately assumed the posture of subservience that had kept him alive for so many years, but something had changed in his bearing. Even in submission, there was a core of resistance that had not been there before. The confrontation that followed was brief, but decisive. Cornelius ordered Samuel back to the quarters and informed Evangeline that she would be confined to her room until further notice. But the damage had already been done. The connection that had formed between them could not be severed by physical separation, and both had tasted something that would make their previous existence impossible to bear. That night, as Samuel lay on his narrow cot and Evangeline sat by her bedroom window, both understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The question now was not whether they would resist, but how. The punishment was swift and calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. Samuel was reassigned to the most brutal work in the tobacco fields, his hands that had gently arranged flowers now bleeding from handling the harsh leaves under the scorching sun. Evangeline was forbidden from leaving the main house, her meals reduced to the bare minimum necessary for survival. But Cornelius had underestimated the strength of the bond he had inadvertently created. The other enslaved people, initially suspicious of Samuel's privileged position, now saw him suffering the same brutal treatment they endured daily. A network of subtle communication developed, with messages passed through the house servants who still had access to Evangeline. The plantation's head cook, an elderly woman named Celia who had survived 40 years of enslavement through careful observation and strategic silence, became an unlikely ally. She had watched the transformation in both Evangeline and Samuel, recognizing in their connection something that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and status. Through her, small tokens were exchanged: a pressed flower from Evangeline's garden, a carefully copied passage from a book. Evangeline's confinement had an unexpected effect. Rather than breaking her spirit, it clarified her understanding of her own imprisonment. She began to see the parallels between her gilded cage and the brutal bondage that held Samuel and the others. The weight she had carried for years began to fall away, not through deprivation, but through the burning away of illusions. Samuel, despite the physical hardships of fieldwork, found strength in the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The conversations with Evangeline had awakened something in him that could not be killed by exhaustion or brutality. He began to speak quietly with other enslaved people, sharing not just the books he had read, but the ideas they contained. The seeds of something larger were beginning to take root. As autumn arrived with its promise of harvest and change, an underground network of resistance began to form around the unlikely partnership of Evangeline and Samuel. The plantation's blacksmith, a massive man named Isaiah who had lost 2 fingers to his master's cruelty, became a key figure in facilitating communication. His work took him throughout the plantation, providing cover for the careful exchange of information and small acts of defiance. Evangeline used her remaining privileges to gather intelligence about Cornelius's business dealings, his travel schedule, and the layout of the plantation's financial records. Her years of being dismissed as decorative had given her access to conversations and documents that men assumed she couldn't understand or wouldn't remember. She proved them catastrophically wrong. Samuel's literacy became a weapon of quiet revolution. He began teaching other enslaved people to read using charcoal and scraps of paper, holding clandestine lessons in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. The knowledge spread like wildfire through the quarters, each person who learned to read becoming a potential teacher for others. The transformation in Evangeline continued to accelerate. The woman who had once spent her days in idle luxury now used every moment to gather information, plan strategies, and coordinate with the growing network of resistance. Her weight loss was dramatic, but it was the change in her bearing that was most remarkable. She moved with purpose now, her eyes sharp with intelligence that had been dormant for too long. Cornelius, increasingly paranoid about the changes he observed in his wife, hired additional overseers and implemented stricter controls over the enslaved population. But he failed to recognize that the rebellion he feared was not being planned in the quarters. It was being orchestrated from within his own house. The irony was perfect. In trying to humiliate both his wife and his property, he had created the very partnership that would ultimately destroy him. The discovery came through Evangeline's careful examination of Cornelius's financial records. Hidden among routine business correspondence, she found evidence of debts that would bankrupt the plantation within months. Cornelius had been borrowing heavily against future tobacco crops, gambling on commodity prices that had failed to materialize. Magnolia Grove was living on borrowed time. This revelation changed everything. The network of resistance that had formed around personal liberation suddenly had a larger target: the complete collapse of the plantation system that had enslaved them all. Evangeline shared this information with Samuel during one of their rare, carefully orchestrated meetings in the root cellar. "He's planning to sell people to cover his debts," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Families will be separated, children sold away from their mothers." Samuel's response was immediate and decisive. The time for passive resistance had ended. Using the literacy network he had established, he began coordinating with enslaved people on neighboring plantations, sharing information about Cornelius's financial weakness, and building a coalition of resistance that extended far beyond Magnolia Grove. The plan that emerged was audacious in its scope. Rather than attempting escape, which would only save a few individuals, they would orchestrate the complete economic collapse of Cornelius's empire. Crops would be sabotaged, equipment would mysteriously break, and key information would find its way to Cornelius's creditors at precisely the right moment to maximize damage. Evangeline's role was crucial. As Cornelius's wife, she had legal access to documents and the ability to travel to town without suspicion. She began making copies of incriminating financial records, preparing evidence that would expose not just her husband's debts, but his illegal activities, including the smuggling of enslaved people across state lines to avoid taxes. The woman who had once been a symbol of Southern gentility was about to become the architect of its destruction. The collapse, when it came, was swift and devastating. Cornelius returned from a business trip to Charleston to find his tobacco crop mysteriously diseased, his equipment sabotaged beyond repair, and his creditors demanding immediate payment on loans he could no longer service. The carefully orchestrated campaign of resistance had achieved its goal with surgical precision, but the personal cost was enormous. Samuel was discovered teaching a group of children to read and was sentenced to a brutal public whipping that nearly killed him. As he lay unconscious in the quarters, tended by Celia and the other enslaved people, Evangeline made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She walked into Cornelius's study carrying the copies of financial documents she had been secretly gathering for months. Her husband looked up from his desk, his face haggard with stress and defeat, and saw in his wife's expression something that chilled him to the bone. "I know about the debts," she said simply. "I know about the illegal slave trading. I know about the forged documents and the bribes to customs officials." The confrontation that followed was the final act of their marriage. Cornelius, faced with the evidence of his crimes and the reality of his financial ruin, made one last desperate attempt to assert his authority. He raised his hand to strike her, but Evangeline caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Touch me," she said quietly, "and these documents go to the federal marshals tomorrow." In that moment, the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 5 years shifted irrevocably. Cornelius saw in his wife's eyes not the submissive woman he had married, but someone who had been transformed by suffering and solidarity into something far more dangerous, a person with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The plantation that had stood as a symbol of Southern prosperity was about to become a monument to its own destruction. 6 months later, Magnolia Grove stood empty, its fields overgrown with weeds, and its grand house shuttered against the wind. Cornelius had fled to Europe ahead of his creditors, leaving behind a legacy of debt and disgrace. The enslaved people had been sold to cover his obligations, but many had already disappeared into the network of safe houses and free communities that stretched north toward freedom. Samuel survived his injuries, though he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. The literacy network he had established continued to operate, spreading knowledge and hope throughout the region. He eventually made his way north, where his intelligence and determination earned him a position with the Underground Railroad, helping other enslaved people find their way to freedom. Evangeline's transformation was complete, but came at a terrible price. Disowned by her family and shunned by Charleston society, she found herself alone but free in ways she had never imagined possible. The weight she had carried, both physical and emotional, had been replaced by a lean strength that reflected her inner transformation. She used the small inheritance from her mother to establish a school for freed slaves in a small town outside Richmond. The woman who had once embodied the idle luxury of the plantation aristocracy now spent her days teaching reading and writing to people who had been denied education their entire lives. The connection between Evangeline and Samuel, forged in the crucible of shared resistance, endured despite their physical separation. They corresponded regularly, their letters filled with updates on their work and reflections on the journey that had transformed them both from victims into agents of change. The story of Magnolia Grove became legend in the region, whispered among enslaved people as proof that even the most powerful could fall, and that dignity and humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. In the end, Cornelius's attempt to humiliate and control had created something he never intended, a partnership that helped bring down the very system he had sought to preserve.